Greetings, friends! Wandering Risky here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of November 25th through December 1st of 2024. And this week, we basically have mostly updates in the Kurakhove, Pokrovsk directions. But we'll talk about every single direction as we can. And this week, we're going to continue talking about Velika Novoslovka. We talked about how last week the battle for this town has begun, and this week the Russians have continued their operations to fully secure, to get a better position to storm this town. The first thing we're going to talk about is the full control of the village of Rozdolnovo. The Russians have raised their flags in these directions here. They raised it in the eastern part, or in the western part, in the center. And so this village has been completely captured by Russian forces. The big what if, though, is this stronghold to the west of Rozdolnovka. You can see it on the map here, this area right here. So this controls the road network, and the Russians need to take the stronghold in order to physically cut one of the main roads that supply Velika Novoslovka, and that is still a big unknown. So we don't know if the Russians have actually stormed the stronghold as of yet, but we shall. This is something the Russians need to do. So even though they have taken Rozdolnovka, they still need to storm this stronghold so that they could actually physically cut one of the roads. One thing that's also been coming ahead, that actually happened today, actually, so it's so new that this map has not been updated, is that according to some pro-Russian sources, the Russians have stormed the village of Novokumar. And if that is the case, actually, they already cut this road, basically. But we don't have any geolocated footage, so this is still very new information, but I just wanted to report it because it just came out today, that basically what allegedly happened is the Russians stormed across these fields and reached Novokumar, are now battling for this village. So it hasn't been fully captured. It's just that the Russians have stormed it and are now battling for it. So I wouldn't be surprised if the entire village of Novokumar has fallen. And basically, if Novokumar does fall to the Russians, the Ukrainians will have to retreat behind the Moltka-Yal River here. To retreat back, back here, and then the Russians would have captured two of the roads that supply Velika Novoslovka. And so once the Russians storm this, if the Russians manage to take Novokumar by next week and manage to take the stronghold, then the Russians will have a very solid position on the north of Velika Novoslovka. So let's kind of like zoom out here to see where the Russians will have. The Russians will have a very solid position in the north of Velika Novoslovka, and they'll be able to start storming it from the north, as well as from the east, and as well from the south, because in the south direction, the Russians have made rapid progress to reach the southern part of Velika Novoslovka. So we talked about how last week the Russians were moving along this highway, and this week they fully have captured these agricultural buildings on the outskirts of Velika Novoslovka. Now, some sources say this week the Russians also entered Velika Novoslovka and are battling for these these areas right here. Some sources are saying those were just recon units and just trying to figure out the Ukrainian positions in this area. However, what most people agree with is that the Russians have at least reached right on the outskirts of Velika Novoslovka here. Also this week, the Russians have, according to this map, captured this stronghold to the right here. This is another Ukrainian stronghold that allegedly was captured by the Russians, and so so the Russians are improved, and then also if they capture Novokumar and capture the area that I was mentioning, then they would have surrounded Velika Novoslovka on three sides. And also, along with this, is that the Russians are making rapid progress in this area between Novodonetska and Orozhaina. This area was, first I thought, so there's a bunch of rivers that spread out of Velika Novoslovka. So, we have this river, we have this river, and then we have this river. And so so Velika Novoslovka is actually kind of cut into like three pieces. And so the Russians were advancing to the north here. They were advancing between the two rivers, and now they're also advancing in between these two rivers. And this week they made rapid progress here, advancing, like taking all this land to the northwest of Novodonetska. And so with the capture of that, the Russians have a very good chance of maybe pushing forward here and pushing the Ukrainians to the other side of the Boltskaya River and storming the village of Bladonatka and forcing the Ukrainians to get on the other side of the area. And with that, then they'll fully have the southern part of Velika Novoslovka under control. So that might be what we see this week. We might see the Russians take Bladonatka, and basically force the Ukrainians on the other side of this river that kind of splits Velika Novoslovka in half. And so everything to the east of that river that I've marked here is what the Russians are trying to capture this week or next week, or at least what they're trying to capture, which is where I think. And so once that happens, the Russians will then be able to storm Velika Novosovka on multiple directions. Now, the only thing that is the problem here is there'll be one last line of retreat for the Ukrainians. This line. Now, one thing you've noticed, the Russians don't actually like to fully capture a town. They like, or fully encircling it. They like encircling it in like 3 directions and then allowing one line of retreat so that the Ukrainians say, hey, fuck it, we're not going to like stay here and fight. There's a way to get out. And so when the Russians are storming it from the north here, from like Novokumar, and and then are obviously advancing it to the from the east, and then are advancing it to from the south here, and then they're squeezing it, and the Ukrainians are like, fuck it, we're gonna like give up and try to retreat back here. So the Russians don't, I don't think the Russians will actually try to cut this road. They have it under strict fire control, so when the Ukrainians retreat to try to build some sort of new line of defense somewhere, which I actually don't know where they'd retreat from. There's just a bunch of small villages here. They could retreat back here to the Volchka River here, which gives them some good positions. There's a big city, a big town here that gives them a good positions. There's a bunch of forests and villages along that. But this makes them go all the way back to the Dnieper. Dnieper-Rostok, or just the Dnieper Oblast. So they'll have to give up a lot of land, and there's not really. So it depends on where they want to fall back. But I think the Russians will keep this open, and the Russians have taken Novodarivka and Ronopil, just to push a bit north, so they could start FPV droning Ukrainians who are using this last road, which is the only road they'll be able to use. So. That's Velika Novosovka. The battle for this town is still ongoing. I'm pretty certain that this town will probably be taken by the end of the year. And the preparations to storm it will probably be done within a week or so. So that's Velika Novosovka. And let's continue talking about like kind of the more essence of Kurakhove, the Kurakhove direction here. And one of the biggest news is that the Russians have broken through into the center of Kurakhove. The battles are ongoing for these high-rise buildings areas right here, which is kind of surprising. I thought the Russians would just kind of stop and, just kind of like maybe take the eastern part and just like surround it before they storm it. Because, why storm things directly when that would be very costly? But apparently not. Apparently they just stormed it directly. So we actually have geolocated footage of the Russians raising their flag in this school right here. And we actually have geolocated footage of the Russians being here as well. And so, pro-Russian sources say this area is being contested. Pro-Ukrainian sources says most of this high-rise area is still under Ukrainian control. But one thing we can all agree on is that basically the Russians are now in the center of Kurakhove and are battling for it. And the more the Russians continue putting the squeeze on this Kurakhove cauldron, the harder it will be for the Ukrainians to hold on to their big defense. Because these high-rise buildings and this factory are very solid defense lines for the Ukrainians. But as we saw, even with the battle for Avdiivka, the Ukrainians had a very strong factory there and a high-rise center, but that ultimately fell because of how encircled they were. And this is probably what's going to happen in Kurakhove. Along with this, the Russians are expanding out of Dolinia. Dolinia was captured about a week ago, and now they are advancing in every direction. They are pushing, they have physically cut this road that connected the Uspenska pocket with Kurakhove. They are advancing, to the beyond it, and they have captured, some fields to the north of it. They are moving to the north here and have captured the fields to the, I guess this is north, this is west. And then they have also captured a little bit to the south of it here. So they are slowly blooming the Dolinia pocket. The Russians have also fully captured these agricultural buildings that were, there were some solid defenses for the Ukrainians here, but they managed to capture it. And now one thing that's in trouble is this kind of micro-district of high-rise buildings, this area right here. The Ukrainians are trying to hold on to this with everything they have because they don't want the Russians to kind of link up their defenses in the center of Kurakhove with Dolinia. So there's fierce clashes happening in Kurakhove. The Ukrainians but now let's talk about, we're talking about how the battle for Kurakhove itself, but let's talk about we're talking about the encirclement of Kurakhove. How's that going? Well, let's talk about this kind of pocket here, the Suspenska pocket, which is like a pocket within a pocket. We talked about this last week. And this week, the Russians have fully secured the village of Ilinica. We actually have geolocated footage of the Russians, storming this and clearing. It was like a bit of a movie show. The unit that stormed Ilinica were showing off, like, what, towns did they, what their storming operations. They were droning things and, clearing things out. And then they raised their banner to the west of Ilinica. So Ilinica has completely fallen to the Russians. Some pro-Russian sources, so we have geolocated footage, and then for this village, which I cannot even pronounce, we have geolocated footage of the Russians being on the eastern side of this area. However, pro-Russian sources say that they have, the Ukrainians have given up this village and have retreated back to Hanivka and Veliska High, and so. This makes sense because we talked about how the Russians, there was a geolocated footage of the Russians breaking through here, and this is how Ilinica ultimately fell, because the Russians broke into here and stormed Romanovka, and took this area, and then with the fall of Ilinica, it's going to be, and with the Russians also being, in the fields to the south of this area, then the Ukrainians that are guarding this village are basically in almost an encirclement, and so they're using this line to retreat back to these two villages, which could provide them a more decent defense. So this pocket is rapidly closing. The Ukrainians are slowly retreating back. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians in the next week or so, I'm surprised they haven't done it now, but they stormed the village of Sushka Yar or Constantinople to just force the Ukrainians to the other side of this river and try to storm it, here, take this area. And then once this happens, then, the Ukrainians will have no other choice but to give up Uspenska. And, Uspenska is a really solid defensive choice. They have their strong fortification to the north of it. They have their strong fortification to the south of it. So it's a very good defensive position. That's why they're holding it for so long. But if the Russians storm Sushka Yar or Constantinople this week, or in the next week or so, then this entire pocket will collapse, and the Ukrainians will have to fall back to Kurakhove, and basically these villages along the Vochka River here. This will be where the Ukrainians will have to fall back to. And then the Russians will be able to take everything under this line under their control, and then they'll start moving northwards. Speaking of moving northwards, we also have some more movement here. The Russians are continuing blooming away from Maximovka and Yasna Polana. This week, the Russians have taken more land to the east of Maximovka, and they have taken more land to the north of Maximovka. So more fields are being taken. They're slowly reaching Sushka Yar, and they are also slowly reaching the village of Rozolova here. And one of the main goals here is to cut this highway that supports Kurakhove. So that is one of the main goals, and this pocket is slowly but surely collapsing. Yeah. So that was the south Donetsk direction. A lot of movement in, and I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of this month. So obviously December has started. This is the last month of 2024, but I wouldn't be surprised if Velika Novoslovka and Kurakhove are taken by the end of this month. It would be, and this entire south Donetsk direction is completely ended. So obviously the main goal for the Russians is to probably have something like this, or something like this here. They'll have a good solid defense line with Velika Novoslovka, Kurakhove, with this highway, and this will fully secure their southern flank. Kind of flatten the front line with their positions in Pokrovsk, so that they could start storming Pokrovsk next year. Alrighty, speaking of the Pokrovsk direction, let's talk about it this week. And this is where also a lot of updates have happened. Let's talk about the southern part. So we talked about how the Russians have fully controlled the village of Berestysky this week. However, we got geolocated footage this week of the Russians raising their flags in this dacha area, Berestysky, and this has so we have confirmed that this village has been taken by the Russians, and the Russians have not stopped there, moving along this reservoir, and now the battle for Staroterny has begun. And if that is true, and the Russians are battling for Staroterny, that means they have cut one of the last roads that help support the Ukrainians in Kurakhove. And so Staroterny will probably fall by the end of next week. And if Staroterny falls, then the Ukrainians will have only one road left, which is in this Andreevka-Constantinople area. And obviously, as the Russians push northwards, they'll obviously try to cut this highway, and then Kurakhove will be completely cut off. So the battle for Startany has begun. We shall see if the Russians are able to fully capture it, which I believe they will by the end of next week. But that is something to make sure that the battle for Startany has begun. Along this route, we have geolocated footage that the Russians have fully secured themselves in Sansevka, so everything to the east of this river that lies in this area, in this red line, has been captured. So this area has been captured. We got geolocated footage here. So Sansevka has completely fallen. We also have maps showing that the Russians have fully captured themselves along this rail line, so everything to the east of this rail line has been captured. And so, the Ukrainians are still in these fields to the north of Stara let me scroll in here. Yeah, but there's a Salonia River here that kind of goes to the Vochka River. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians try to clear up this entire pocket, try to take Stara and take everything in these fields. So the Ukrainians are trying to hold these fields to help guard Stara but if Stara falls and they start, and the Russians, hold Stontsivka, then, they're at risk of losing their only road to leave this area. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, within a week or so, manage to take everything that is to the east of this red line, which is the rivers of Vochka and Sonsivka, and so everything here will be taken, and then this will cut the northern supply to Kurakhove, and from there, Russians will probably try to cross the river and start battling for these three villages right here. But right now, their focus is to take these fields, because the main goal is to reach the village of Andriivka and cut this highway that will be the new way that they supply Kurakhove. Along with this, one actually the more interesting areas is the Selidova flower, where the Russians are blooming, and they have made a lot of progress this week. The Russians are moving westwards, or trying to cut this highway that supply. So obviously the Ukrainians could support Kurakhove with this highway, but this is another highway that connects Pokrovsk with Kurakhove, and so the Russians are pushing westwards to try to cut this highway, because then they'll have to, if you look at it from a big point of view, right? So if they, there's this road that connects to Kurakhove, but the only other road they could supply is this road, which leads to here. So, so if this road is out of action, then they have to use this whole long way around to supply Kurakhove, and it will be a lot harder on the logistics. So the Russians are moving, after they secured their positions in these Selidova suburbs, they're now blooming out of these suburbs. And this week, Russian sources are saying they have stormed the village of Pushinka, and they have basically captured this village. And this is one stepping stone on the way to storm the village of Ukrainka, Novolinivka, and Yasanova. They're trying to storm these three villages to try to cut this highway. So they're slowly moving across these fields. We also, most pro-Russian sources say the village of Zorya has completely fallen to the Russians. We don't have geolocated footage, but since the Russians have positions in the south, and they are moving, in the north here, they're able to storm it from three positions, and the village of Zorya has completely fallen, which makes sense. It's on the other side of the river here, and so it was very hard for the Ukrainians to try to hold here. So Zorya has fallen. And one of the most interesting areas is the Russians now moving along this rail line, kind of like what they did when they moved to Novogorivka, where they're moving along this rail line and are trying to reach the southern part of Pokrovsk. Now, one of the main defenses that the Ukrainians have is the village of Shentukenko, and this is going to be a very big, bloody battle. The Ukrainians are going to hold on for this town for a very long time. They're going to try to hold it as much as they can, because if Shentukenko falls, this opens up the Russians to be able to start cutting off this rail line and this road in the western part of Pokrovsk, and start putting the squeeze on the Pokrovsk pocket. So, they're putting themselves in a position to be able to storm Pokrovsk and Leningrad next year. And in terms of progress for that, we talked about how the Russians, took Pushinivka and Pedrivka last week. Well, they have now advanced along this rail line and have captured this rail line, and they have advanced into the village of Zhovtovka and have captured it. And so what's interesting here is that, there is a river here, the Salonia River again, and the Russians are using that to defend their northern flank here. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians push towards Novopushnivka and continue just pushing westwards to give themselves some breathing space to help continue encircling Kurakhove, but also to, be able to give themselves some positions to be able to storm Shenkanko from multiple angles. So Shenkanko is going to be a town that's going to be fought over for like a month or so, but it is something the Russians are slowly but surely pushing from Selidova and pushing northwards here. And then some other progress in the Pokrovsk direction is this area. So one thing the Russians are going to try to do is capture these line of villages here, and then obviously Shenkanko, and then Novotoretska. So if they could capture these, this is where the Russians are going to be aiming in the Pokrovsk direction, because if they could do that, obviously this flattens the front line, and then they'll be able to start, there's many directions the Russians could use. So the Russians could continue pushing along this rail line and try to take the southern part of Minigrad. They could then, once they do that, they could then advance between Pokrovsk and Minigrad and cut it in half. They could then, from here move here and try to cut, the southern part of Pokrovsk here, and then move in this area to cut this highway right here, and then, try to encircle it from multiple directions. The Russians could try to flatten the front line in the north, which I think is what the battle for Toretsk was about. They were trying to take Toretsk, and then with it, they could then try to flatten the front line here, because then, this kind of flattens the front line just as they're doing in the north. But this will take a long while, and I think they're going to just start storming Pokrovsk once they've improved their positions here. And in terms of capturing this line of villages here, the Russians have a lot of sources are saying the Russians have entered the southern part of Lyshtivka and have captured at least the farms that are to the south here. So Lyshtivka is kind of cut in half by a river. And so the northern part is still under Ukrainian control, but the Russians are moving along these fields and have captured the southern part of Lyshtivka. And if that is the case, then a lot of sources are saying the Russians are trying to reach the village of Dasanevsky here, which is to the south of the river. And so it's going to be very hard for the Ukrainians to defend it here, and it's very easy for the Russians to advance towards it. So they could advance from the east here, and then from the north, and then try to take this town here, or this village. And then at that point, the Russians will continue moving along this rail line and try to take the village of Vyazhania and Zelenia, these villages. And then, so the Russians will be slowly but surely, pushing to here and just kind of trying to flatten the front line here to give themselves the ability to storm Pokrovsk in the near future. So that is the Pokrovsk and South Donetsk direction. That is where most of the action happened this week. There's been no changes in the Zaporozhye or Kherson regions. There's also been no changes in the Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, or Seversk direction. Now, one thing I want to mention before we move on is that, just because there's no battles, no changes on the map to go over this week, doesn't mean there's no battles going on. The battles for Toretsk, there's still great battles going over, trying to battle for this mining district in the southern residential area. There's just been no changes. Same with Chasiv Yar. There's strong battles to try to storm the refractory plant, this factory, and but that's still ongoing. So there's been no changes to talk about here. So, but just because there's no change doesn't mean there's no strict fighting going on. Alrighty, now we're going to talk about the Oskol direction, the Liman-Kupiansk direction. And in this week, the Russians have continued making small progress in the Terny. This week, we have geolocated footage that the Russians have stormed and have captured the agricultural buildings in Terny, this area right here. And they are, the battle for center of Terny is still ongoing, but it's a very bloody affair. So the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to Terny as much as they can, but the Russians made some small progress here, but just very, very small. And then in the Kupiansk direction, we talked about how the Russians have fully secured the village of Kopany last week, and now the Russians are pushing more westwards along these three villages that they captured toward the village of Zelenia High. So they have, they have tried to capture these fields between Zelenia High and Vyshana and Petrovozhania. And the village has not been taken, but the Russians are obviously trying to storm it. And so they're moving closer to this village. And then obviously the whole point of this is to start again making their positions ready to storm Borovia, which is one of the main. This is not as big as Kupiansk or Liman, but it's one of the biggest villages that support the whole operation in the center of this entire area. So if they could capture Borovia, it will greatly affect the logistics for all the Ukrainians in the center part of this Oskol front. Anyway, speaking of Kupiansk, there's been some more changes more to the north here. One thing is that the Russians completely withdrew from this this area of Kupiansk, it looks like the Russians kind of retreated back to the tree areas to the north of it, but they've retreated from Kupiansk itself because they couldn't support their positions here. So maybe this was a distraction operation because just when the Russians withdrew, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians are starting an operation to encircle Dorichia. Sources are saying that they've crossed the Osko River and have captured the village of Novomelinska here and gained a foothold here. And then the Russians have also stormed to the south of Dorichia and have captured these fields here. And so, it's kind of interesting because then, if they cross the Oskol, then it'll be very hard to logistically supply the Russian positions in Dorichnia. So I don't know if this is just another distraction operation or maybe this is what, But anyway, capturing Dorichnia will be a very big boon to the Russians, but I think this might be just a distraction because the whole thing about it is that, if they try, it's going to be very hard to storm Dorichnia, especially if you have to get supplies there. And, it's like obviously, the whole goal is to, if they cross the Oskos, to try to recapture these lands that were lost in 2022. But to be honest, I think this is just to distract the Ukrainians and pull troops away from Kupiansk. So, but yeah, so there's been some small progress in the Kupiansk direction, and we shall follow that continuously. Alrighty, next, there's been no changes in the Kharkov direction, and then we have the Kursk direction. So in the Kursk direction, there have been some small changes, and let's talk about them. So this week, we talked about how last week the Russians have completely captured the village of Darinio and Nikolaevo Darinio, and this week the Russians are improving their positions around Nishkakin and Zelina Shlak. And so the Russians have captured these fields here to the south of there, and they're improving their positions to secure themselves in this little area that they have here. And so obviously the Russians are trying to push towards the village of Severodolonovkovko here, and we shall see if the Russians are able to take this village and start pushing and pushing towards these three villages here and try to reach this railroad. However, we have some more geolocated footage. The Ukrainians are still to the north of the village of Kruchodonovko here. They are still in these fields here. The Russians liquidated this forest here, but the Ukrainians are still in these fields here. So this might explain why the push, the Russians might have Novoinovka and Zelina Shlak, and that means the Ukrainians can still attack them from the north. So, and this is probably why they can't continue pushing south here from the villages from Potobivki, because the Ukrainians are still in these forests here. So obviously the main goal here for the Russians is to try to take this pocket, but it's very hard for them to do so. And then another thing is that the Russians apparently have pushed through and have reached the northern outskirts of the village of Maternovko and have captured these kind of tree lines right here. So apparently that's what's happened, and we shall see if the Russians could hold on there. But this is a good first step to try to reach the village of Suchka, which is one of the main goals for the Russians here. Alrighty, so that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. And I hope you guys be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates. Be sure to comment your thoughts and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.